Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 381. This week the questions are taken from guide 448 on the Soviet Sverdlov class cruisers, the Wednesday video on the British Pacific Fleet as they headed for Sakishima, and the Friday video on that time the Fleet Air Arm dropped an aircraft almost on my granddad's head. Not6JS716 asks, do you take script proposals or drafts for interesting ships that you haven't covered? A qualified yes. So if there's a particularly interesting ship that you think I haven't covered, then you're perfectly welcome to send me a Discord message, an email, or a comment in the chat as to what you think I should be covering. So, you know, hey, you haven't covered this ship yet. I think it would be really interesting because XYZ. That I'm fine with. If it's a particularly obscure ship, so one that maybe 99% of people won't even be aware exists even tangentially, or if it's a very particular ship within a class, so let's say, for example, your father or grandfather, or possibly even great-grandfather these days, served on a particular Fletcher class. Now, everybody's aware that the Fletcher class exists, obviously, but there are so many of them that very, very few people will be aware of what exactly every single one of them was named. But if you have this very particular Fletcher class in mind, let's say because of one of your ancestors serving on it, then, you know, if you said, okay, I'd like you to cover this particular ship from this class, again, fine, you know, with a little bit of reasoning, I can add it to the list. I can't necessarily promise where in the list it will go, but it certainly can be added to the list. And in the event of these very obscure ships or a particular ship out of a particular class, if there's some particular notable reason you want me to cover it, then I'm happy for you to either point me to a specific source. So, I don't know, let's say Romanian destroyers. You know, yes, I've got, actually, believe it or not, one or two books about Romanian destroyers, but let's face it, they're not particularly significantly large books. But if you did want me to cover a Romanian destroyer, and you knew, hey, there's this really detailed source, whether it be in Romanian or English or whatever, then point me to the source, and I will very happily do that. Or in the case of a family member serving aboard a ship, and they had some particular reminiscences, you know, about a specific incident that's maybe not covered in the general history books or whatever, again, I'm very happy to take that information aboard and incorporate it as possible within a 5-minute guide. The only thing I would say, I wouldn't necessarily, I don't know about accept, you send it to me, I can't really do much about that, but I wouldn't necessarily pay a huge amount of attention to would be if somebody's like, here's my 1.5-page script for a 5-minute guide, or multi-pages for a Wednesday video. I've already done the work for you, can you please just record it? Because one of the things, of course, with these videos is I need to research them. I need to verify that the information is correct, and actually having a pre-written script presented to me, that means rather than just going and finding the information and then writing into a script myself, I'm having to go and find the information and then compare it to that script. Now, I'm not implying that if you've carefully researched a draft script or something that you would be wrong, because you may well have done a really good research job, but I don't know that. And if it's going out on my channel, I have to know that what I'm saying is accurate, so I have to check, at which point it's just a duplication of effort and work. Plus, of course, even if someone did present me with a draft script, I would almost certainly end up rewriting it anyway, so that it's in my style. So again, something of a duplication of work. So yeah, suggest ships, provide me with sources, very happy to run with that. Completed scripts where it's kind of, I've done this work, please record it and broadcast it for me, not so much. Although with that said, if you are a subject matter expert on a particular ship or class of ships that you would like to have covered, and you're happy to come on and be interviewed as a guest speaker, that's completely different, because, yeah, then, you know, we'll sort something out. Michael Kovacic, I think, asks, given that these Sverdlovs were based on the Chaplains, what would a German post-World War II cruiser based on the pre-war Hipper class look like? Were there actually any plans to build more 8-inch cruisers after completing the 5 ships of the Hipper class? Because I got the impression that it would have been more 11-inch cruisers in the 20,000-ton range that would have been built. And incidentally, could you perhaps tell us how long it currently takes for a question to be answered in the Drydock? Well, according to Plan Z, or Plan Z for whatever it's worth, the 5 ships of the Hipper class would have been, that's the end, that's it. As far as German heavy cruiser production was concerned, for a while. They were then going to try and beef up their light cruiser and Panzerschiff wings, so most people would point towards the P-class cruiser, which is essentially Deutschland but faster, as being the next design, and that would have actually been in the, as you said, 11-inch cruisers in the roughly 20,000-ton range, although to be fair, the last Hipper-class hulls had nearly reached that displacement anyway. Now, if we were to hypothetically imagine that there would be a post-war German cruiser based on the Hipper-class hull, I mean, good luck, you've got a fairly substantial hull to work with, so that's good. It kind of depends on how you're looking at this. Are we looking at this as a kind of the Allies are getting the Germans to rearm even more extensively and telling them, hey, well, you've got an existing design, your shipyards know how to build this? Or is it a somehow Germany manages to eke out a peace treaty and has to continue with their existing technology? Because the single biggest problem that the Germans would face building a post-World War II heavy cruiser is fundamentally having been left behind by a number of very key technological advances, specifically auto-loading for the big guns. Because, you could build something like a Hipper in the post-World War II environment, but against something like a Des Moines, which has auto-loading guns, or various hypothetical or near-hypothetical light cruiser designs like the Worcesters or the Minotaurs, which obviously ended up being paper-only. But even those 6-inch ships could throw far too many shells for a Hipper with conventional firing 8-inch to deal with. Whereas, in theory, if Germany is being rearmed with Allied assistance, then they could get access to at least some of the technologies that the Allies have. I'm not necessarily sure the US Navy would be willing to share the auto-loading 8-inch design with the Germans right after they've just finished fighting a massive war with them, but there could be some other things that they might share. But very, very broadly, if it was up to me, I would tell them, okay, given the beam of the hull, beat Krupp into submission and get them to design a triple turret that isn't the width of a small continent for the 8-inch guns, have 2 triple 8-inch up front, 1 single triple 8-inch aft. That'll allow you to shorten up the citadel and the superstructure, ditch the amidships aircraft positions, because of course late 1940s helicopters are coming in, so the helicopter will be operating off the aft deck, which will also help shorten up the superstructure, and ditch the torpedoes, because obviously the Hippers have a fairly heavy torpedo armament, and between all of those various weight savings, you should be able to implement maybe 3 or 4 twin mounts of dual-purpose 127-128mm guns on each side. And even, because obviously at the moment the Hippers have 105mm guns, I think you could quite easily get 4 twin mounts down each side, especially once you've ditched the torpedoes, which also allow you to drop the anti-aircraft mounts down a level. And then maybe you could get another mount super firing over the aft triple mount. So, and that would actually give you 10 127-128mm guns on each broadside, which would actually be quite a substantial anti-aircraft armament. Or alternatively, you could go with perhaps 1 or 2 more additional mounts, so maybe 5 down each side and 1 super firing aft, of some kind of lighter semi-auto-loading or auto-loading thing. If you've got trade with the Allies, maybe the auto-loading 3-inch 50 twins, or some vague version that you could hypothetically dream up thereof for Germany to give it a slightly smaller caliber, but quite heavy overall anti-aircraft battery. As for how long it takes to get a question currently answered in the Drydock, well, I think the current videos that I'm taking the questions from are from June-ish, late June, early July. So at that point, we're looking at running about 6 months in arrears at the moment. The main issue is that obviously because each end of the month is a Patreon Drydock, which doesn't include questions from regular videos, that means that every month we slip backwards by 1 week. But then every few months or so I do a month which it takes double questions, i.e. we take questions from 2 weeks of videos instead of one for a month, which catches us up a bit. So at the moment we're 6 months in arrears. I do want to try and keep the Drydock at least, a month and a half, 2 months in arrears, because that means I can then get ahead of things pre-recording for when I'm away. But at the moment, 6 months, I do need to catch up. So maybe next month I'll do a catch-up month and drag things a bit further forward. Almirante Brown asks, did the Arctic convoys rescue any of the crews of the U-boats and Luftwaffe aircraft they destroyed on the way to Murmansk or Archangel? And if so, were those prisoners of war handed over to the Soviets or kept as prisoners on British ships for eventual transfer to prison camps in the UK? It did occasionally happen, but I actually went through the list of all the U-boats known to have definitively been sunk by Arctic convoy escorts, and it turns out that actually there were only 3 cases where there were survivors, that being U-472, U-973, which was sunk within a couple of days of each other while trying to attack the same convoy, and U-307. Those are the only 3 subs that were specifically sunk by Arctic convoy escorts that I could find that had any survivors at all. And it's kind of illustrative in that U-472 and 307 were sunk. They were caught on the surface and sunk, or forced to the surface and sunk. I can't remember which way around it was, but basically they were on the surface when they were eventually sent to the bottom. And as a result, some of the crew got out into life rafts and could be picked up, whereas U-973, although she was also on the surface when sunk, she went down pretty much instantly once hit, as opposed to the others, which kind of settled. And as a result, while there were quite a few survivors from the 472 and the 307, in the 973's case, there were, from the convoy's perspective, known to only be 3 survivors. And one of them died from exposure shortly after it was hauled on board. And this kind of illustrates the point of, even if your sub happens to be on the surface or makes it to the surface when it's attacked, in the Arctic waters, you pretty much have to get into some kind of raft or other kind of thing that keeps you out of the water, or hope against hope that whatever's sinking you is right there, because if you're left in the Arctic waters for more than a couple of minutes, you're dead. So it wouldn't matter even if you survived the sinking. If the thing that sank you was, let's say, a swordfish dropping a depth charge or firing a rocket, and the nearest Allied ship is, let's say, 2 miles away, it might as well be 200 miles away, because it's never going to get you in time. Whereas if you're in a raft, 2 miles away, you might last long enough for them to pick you up. And a similar thing with aircrew. There are a tiny handful of German aircrew that were picked up, but by and large, if an aircraft is shot down, it's going to be one of 2 things. Either it's going to be a long-distance observer-patrol aircraft that's probably going to be trying to make a run for it when it gets jumped by fighters from an escort carrier, at which point it's going to go down quite a distance from the convoy, and harsh as it might sound, the convoy can't afford to send an escort dozens potentially of miles away on the uncertain hope that maybe somebody has survived. And of course, you're in a burning, crashing aircraft, there's a good chance you don't survive anyway. And then similar to the U-boats, even if you do survive, if you're just in the water, you're going to be dead in minutes. So most of the time, the convoy commanders took the view of, well, if something's gone down on the horizon, there's a minuscule chance that somebody might have survived, but can we afford to risk so many lives in the convoy by detaching an escort which could then let a U-boat in? No. So that didn't happen, usually. If an aircraft got shot down somewhere vaguely ahead, and as the convoy approached they saw a raft, they obviously would send someone out to pick them up. And the other alternative, of course, is that the aircraft is shot down while it is attacking the convoy. And usually, if the aircraft is attacking the convoy, it's not alone. And so if an aircraft does get shot down, again with the same very small chance that anyone actually survives that crash for more than a couple of minutes, well, the convoy is moving at speed and is under attack and can't afford to stop, because if it does stop to pick you up, one of its friends is probably going to drop a torpedo or a bomb on you. And by the time the attack is over, the convoy will have moved many, many miles past the point of the crash and therefore be very unlikely to detach anybody to go and pick up the aircrew. Again, assuming that there were any, because, well, apart from anything, you've just been under air attack, there's no guarantee that more aircraft aren't going to show up any minute. But if you were perhaps lucky and there was maybe a 2-3 aircraft attack, a small attack on a convoy, and they went for the head of the convoy and something got shot down, and maybe there was an escort carrier present and those fighters could confirm, yeah, there's nobody around, and there's somebody who survived the crash and is in a life raft and has maybe drifted towards the rear of the convoy, then occasionally, yeah, there would be a pickup or two. So rare, very rare, thanks to a combination of circumstances and environment, but it did happen. And given the extensive interrogation reports of the crews, especially of the 472 and 973, which, as I said, were sunk on the same convoy and hauled back by the same ship, it would appear that the crews were generally taken back to the UK. You know, they'd been taken prisoner by the Royal Navy, therefore they were British prisoners, therefore they would be held in Britain. And I actually looked up to confirm that, and indeed one of the senior officers aboard U-472 is recorded as having seen out the war in a prisoner of war camp in the UK. So yes, they were definitely being taken back to the UK. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, when looking at the proposals for unbuilt Imperial Russian dreadnoughts, one comes across a design that has 16 16-inch guns in 4 quadruple turrets. The details of the design mentioning that it was supposed to be for the Black Sea but never progressed further because it was too big for the Black Sea. Why? I understand the Ottomans were a threat, but this design seems more well suited to fighting the Germans in the first place. So why was the design never considered for the Baltic fleet? It'd be interesting to see where you found that notation. So if you don't mind, send me a message in some form that shows, you know, which source you got that from, because there were a lot of 16-inch armed designs floating around in Russian naval circles during World War One. This one, which you can see on the screen at the moment, this was actually the official Battleship 1915, which, as you can see, has 12 16-inch guns in 3 quadruple turrets, and this is actually what they were planning on building for the Baltic. So the answer to why didn't the Russians consider any 16-inch armed ships for the Baltic? Well, they did. Here it is. They were basically going to start building these as soon as the Borodino or Ismail class battlecruisers were off the slipways, and then these things would take their place. As far as 16-inch armed ships for the Black Sea, I've seen designs that have 8, 10 and 12 16-inch guns for the Black Sea. The only 16-inch gun design that I've seen was the Gavrilov design, which was come up privately. So it wasn't an official Russian Navy design, but it was one of many designs that private Russian ship designers came up with and suggested as maybe we should go for this. And that was actually also designed for the Baltic. And, well, as you said, it's 4 quadruple turrets. So basically like a Gangut on steroids. So essentially, yes, they were considering 16-inch armed ships for the Baltic. They did plan on building them. And as far as I'm aware, the 16-gun design was also intended for the Baltic, although, as I said, private design, not an official Russian Navy design. But if you have information that shows that there was also a 16-gun design for the Black Sea specifically, particularly with notes on how it was too big for the Black Sea, again, please let me know, because that would be something that I didn't know about. Roscoe White asks, the channel 1984 Lore recently ran a video looking at the Oceanian floating fortresses in the novel, speculating on their nature and where they might be located. I'd be curious as to your take on this topic. Well, we don't really get all that much information from 1984 on what the floating fortresses are, other than they consume colossal amounts of resources. They are, well, the clues in the name, floating, and they can be sunk. And they are anchored in place, so they're sort of semi-static once they're in various locations. They're kind of like holding the line in various areas of the world's oceans. So they can't be oil rigs, or something similar to an oil rig, or like the anti-aircraft fortress platforms that were put in the Thames estuary. They have to be some kind of ship. But since they're supposed to take the resources of several hundred cargo ships to build, and they're described as being built on slipways, and later on even potentially dismantled or sunk as being obsolete before new ones are built, if I had to hypothesize on what exactly a floating fortress would be, given that the world of 1984 seems to be, maybe 2 steps ahead of the late 1940s period when Orwell's writing from, but not to the point of the 1980s as we actually know them. And remember that Orwell makes note of the use of rocket bombs, which we know, sticking a rocket motor to a tall boy was one of the madcap ideas of the late 1940s. I think probably that a floating fortress is an adaptation of a Habakkuk-type aircraft carrier, bearing in mind especially that obviously Oceania is made up in large part of the US and the UK and their former imperial territories, plus South America and a few other places. So it would make sense that they would take that core idea and perhaps resurrect it. So at that point, in terms of them being built on slipways, I would suspect that what they're doing there is, as was planned for the Habakkuk's, you would build sections of a floating fortress on slipways. These would then be floated out as essentially modules and joined up together at sea to form the larger floating fortress. And if you've got to deal with rocket bombs, which could be particularly large, plus all the other threats that you might imagine from a late 40s perspective going on into the future, I think probably what you're looking at is some kind of either probably stepped pyramid type, elongated stepped pyramid type structure, probably made up in part of pikecrete and in part of steel, because it does mention they do use a lot of steel, but for sheer bulk and size, I think they've probably got pikecrete layering as well. At which point you're probably looking at the highest point, so this obviously somewhat elongated, almost barge-like shape. The top deck, if you like, is going to be a flight deck, because these things, once they're anchored, you're going to need to bring them supplies, you're going to need to provide them with air support, and the best way to do that would be to have a really big flight deck up top that could launch its own defensive air wing and receive incoming cargo flights with supplies of various types as well. And then on your various steps down towards the outer hull, you would have your defences. So around the perimeter of the actual flight deck, you'd have your light anti-aircraft defences, then lots of batteries of heavy anti-aircraft guns on a step down, which would also double as your close-range torpedo protection. And then on the step below that, you'd have probably dozens of battleship caliber guns. And this whole thing could therefore be built in sections, as I said, assembled in a harbour, outfitted in a harbour, and then floated out, taken out to sea, so hence floating. But then because anything Habakkuk scale is going to be relatively slow, you anchor it, and then the engines basically become power generators for all your weapons systems. That would be my vague idea of what a floating fortress would be like, because then they can be sunk by massive assault, but it would be very, very difficult to do. And if you've got multi-layered steel and pikecrete infill armouring and shaping, this would also perhaps explain why some of the floating fortresses are broken up or dismantled relatively soon after their construction, because obviously although the technology has been somewhat stagnant, there would be a continually evolving threat of new and improved and larger rocket bombs, presumably torpedoes from submarines and so forth. And so if somebody comes up with an even bigger, even nastier rocket bomb, or a really big long-range torpedo, like some variant on the helm over, then suddenly the anti-torpedo defences or the number or scale of anti-aircraft guns you've allowed for on a floating fortress might not be enough, and that might be evident because one of its related predecessors has just been blown up or sunk, and therefore you have to start over again. So that would be my general thoughts on the idea. Of course, there is the small problem that Oceania is so full of lies and deception that you can't really be absolutely certain that anything that the Ingsoc propaganda describes is even in existence, let alone accurately described. Commander Tomalak asks, considering that the Dutch did not begin planning the design 1047 battlecruisers until 1938, and the ships themselves were inspired by and based on the Scharnhorst class, is it at all reasonable to suggest that alternatively the Dutch might also have considered building their own version of the Deutschland class in the years prior to this, or as a cheaper alternative to the 1047 in the historic time frame? And if so, might they have been able to fulfill the same risk strategy role as the 1047? Potentially speed might be an issue, since a Congo could run such a ship down, so they might have had to alter the design to use steam turbines to get greater speed. I don't think the Deutschlands or anything particularly similar to the Deutschlands would have held the Dutch interest all that much, because fundamentally the Deutschland class is not particularly well armoured heavy cruiser with massive guns. Yes, of course, the armour belt is thick enough to deal with a 6-inch fire, but when the Dutch are designing ships like the 1047, they're looking at defending their holdings in the Dutch East Indies, and Japan has stuff that's considerably bigger than 6-inch guns. So, yeah, the problem with the Deutschlands would be essentially not just the Congos, but even the Japanese heavy cruisers, because the Japanese heavy cruisers, obviously, earlier on, that'd be the Miyokos and then the Takaos, etc., with 10 8-inch guns, they could hurt a Deutschland or a Deutschland subvariant as well, and they're, again, more than fast enough to catch such a thing. The Deutschland is very much a long-distance commerce raider. That's not what the Dutch need for defence. Now, there are some outgrowths or variations of the Deutschland class that might be a bit more attractive. In the initial stages of their design, people were for the Deutschlands were looking at two alternatives: the sort of faster, more lightly protected cruiser, which is eventually what you end up getting, but they were also looking at a slower, much more heavily protected and slightly more heavily armed coastal defence ship type. That might have some attraction to the Dutch. It would certainly be able to at least deal with Japanese heavy cruisers, but potentially would have the problem of it would be too slow to deal with either Congos or even, Fusos and Iseis, so that might be too broad of a range of exposure for them. The other thing that maybe would be attractive would be in the later stages of Deutschland class design, or potentially in the design process that followed them, depending on who you believe and exactly how you time everything. There were a huge flurry of other alternate designs, at least one of which was essentially roughly speaking, doubling the displacement of the Deutschland, putting in steam turbines to get it up to 32, 33 knots, and massively updating its armour to have, I think it was something like a maximum of almost 9 inches of armour, so metric conversion would be about 220 millimeters, which makes sense because that was the Germans working in metric. And at that stage, that potentially could be of significant interest to the Dutch, because that's more than enough armour to deal with any cruisers the Japanese throw around. It's fast enough to evade pretty much anything that isn't a Congo refit, and depending on when in the interwar period it's actually considered, it might either be fast enough to outrun a Congo, because remember the Congo's speed varies quite considerably depending on which stage of its refit and modification it's on. Almost 9 inches of armour would actually make the belt thicker than the Congos, so in a standoff fight, even if you were talking about later refitted Congos, it might actually have a chance of defending itself. And yeah, okay, 6 11-inch guns isn't as good as 8 14-inch guns, but then the Congos are, only rocking 8 inches of armour themselves, so it could still hurt a Congo, and it could outrun anything that's got more firepower than a Congo. And I suppose if you swapped out the 1111s on the Deutschlands, which to be honest weren't fantastic, with the 1111s designed for the Scharnhorsts, then that, as a whole combination on about 20 to 22,000 tons, might actually make a pretty darn decent budget ship for the defence of the Dutch East Indies. As you can see, I've kind of mocked up roughly what I think that might look like on screen. PH89787 asks, did the Japanese attempt to develop a kamikaze specifically to punch through the heavy armour found on the British Pacific Fleet's armoured carriers and the US and Royal Navy's battleships? While it wasn't a specific response to the presence of the British Pacific Fleet's armoured carriers, the Japanese do appear to have invented a kamikaze specifically designed to deal with heavily armoured targets, that of course being the Oka, or Cherry Blossom, this rocket-propelled suicide bomb. Now, depending on the source will depend on whether or not you consider it truly armour-piercing. As you can see, it had a pretty darn big bomb, which made up the nose section. Most sources just say it's an awful, like over a ton of ammonal high explosive, which, you know, combined with its rocket power, that's going to overcome a fair bit of light to medium armour anyway. Potentially, if you get the right dive angle, including the armoured carrier's flight deck. However, some of the more detailed sources that I found do indicate that this bomb did have a hardened steel nose and or case, which would make it at least semi-armour piercing, if not fully armour piercing, and those sources also do indicate it was supposed to deal with armoured targets. But obviously I'm not an aviation historian, and sources do conflict. To a degree. I mean, I suppose the ones that say this is the warhead size, they're not saying it's not a semi-armour piercing or armour piercing bomb, they're just not making a comment on it. So if the more detailed sources that I found are accurate and this was some kind of semi-armour piercing or armour piercing warhead, then yes, in technical terms, this would be a kamikaze specifically designed to deal with heavily armoured targets. But those of you who know more about this, the flying things that buzz around ships and are very annoying, please let me know in the comments below if it was in fact an AP kamikaze. Atypical Programmer asks 3 related questions, so I'll go through them quickly as we answer them. First, my hypothesis was that battlecruisers have a higher power-to-weight ratio than fast battleships, which would in turn have a higher power-to-weight ratio than regular battleships. But after writing a script for a video and downloading all the power-to-weight ratios, I found this didn't work, as fast battleships have as high or higher power-to-weight ratios as battlecruisers. Do you have any idea why this is? Yeah, simply because fast battleships have to reach almost as fast, or in some cases faster speeds than battlecruisers, bearing in mind that the vast majority of battlecruisers are built in the World War I period, so they're achieving speeds in the high 20s of knots, which are then going to be comparable, or possibly even fractionally slower, depending on the ship, as compared to fast battleships, which typically are around 28 knots, and even the faster battlecruisers like Renown, Repulse, Hood, Congo refits, etc., they're still in the low 30s of knots, which is comparable to something like an Iowa. But for almost all battlecruisers, they are of course hauling around at a given speed. Let me say, if you match up something like a 28 knot-ish battlecruiser to a normal fast battleship, or Renown, Repulse, Hood, Congos to something like an Iowa, the Iowa is having to haul around more guns, or the fast battleship, let's say, is having to haul around more guns, possibly bigger, but almost always more, and more armour than a battlecruiser at the same speed. Therefore, if you want to move at that speed, the fast battleship is going to need more power to do so. Now, of course, that is going to be highly variable, because something like Hood, which carries protection-wise almost as much protection as many battleships, and also the firepower of many battleships, is going to throw that calculation out. It's going to kind of be the oddball. But if you compare most battlecruisers with fast battleships of equivalent speed, basically the fast battleships having to haul around more weight is the reason why that happens. He then asks, why do the Gangot and Queen Elizabeth classes have such a high power-to-weight ratio? They're almost as powerful as battlecruisers, yet they're not even fast battleships. So, similar reasons to the actual fast battleships, but essentially what you're looking at is extensive increases in armour and firepower as compared to contemporary battlecruisers with the Queen Elizabeths, and thus also more displacement, and because of having a much more heavily armoured citadel, more concentrated, also a shorter hull, so less favourable length to breadth ratio. So if you compare, let's say, the Queen Elizabeth to HMS Tiger, for instance, Tiger is a longer ship. It has only 10,000 more horsepower, and yes, it's 3-4 knots faster than a Queen Elizabeth, but it's carrying about two-thirds to three-quarters of the thickness in armour, covering a much smaller area, and it's carrying 13.5-inch guns as opposed to 15-inch guns. So essentially, with the Queen Elizabeths, it's a case of it's just hauling around so much more than a contemporary battlecruiser that with almost as much power, it's still going somewhat slower. And for the Gangutts, well, if we compare them, let's say Moltke, because, well, the Germans are a bit closer to the Russians, then although the Gangutts are somewhat less well protected than a lot of battleships of their period, they're still carrying quite a lot of weight of armour because they have full-length armour, which is something the Russians were still sticking with. And although they're only carrying 12-inch guns, they're of course carrying a dozen of them compared to, let's say, Moltke, which is carrying 10 guns, so 2 less already, and they're 11-inch guns, so slightly lighter there. And these two have roughly comparable power plants, just over 50,000 horsepower each, but Gangut is actually a relatively nifty ship. You know, it's only about a knot or two slower than a Moltke. They're pretty darn quick, at least on trials. So in actual fact, that's not necessarily a hugely unexpected result. Lengthwise, they're very close to each other, and essentially the Gangutts are probably carrying about as much weight in armour as the Moltke is, just more spread out somewhat, and it's carrying a heavier armament. Therefore, it's not exactly surprising that it would be, almost as fast, but not quite. And then finally, why do the Borodino class have such a low power-to-weight ratio, which is lower than some battleships? Well, in part, they have a pretty good length-to-beam ratio, which is going to help. In part, although they are battlecruisers, they're not actually that fast, especially for the time period that they're being built. They're being built 1912 onwards, when contemporary, well, both German and British as well as Japanese battlecruisers are kind of aiming for a bit more than just over 26 knots. And the only real exception to that in terms of at least design speed is the Der Flingers, and the Der Flingers have slightly less power output than the Borodinos, but are also design speed-wise actually roughly similar, around 26 knots and a bit. The Borodinos having more and bigger guns, but less armour than a Der Flinger. Josh Thomas Moore asks, given the Mark 14 was being the Mark 14, could the US submarine crews in the early part of the Pacific War have used the British or Dutch torpedoes, assuming that supply wasn't an issue? Unfortunately, not just by swapping them out, because even though they're all 21-inch torpedoes, there are some rather important differences. Firstly, if you take, for example, the British Mark 8 torpedo, very typical submarine-launched torpedo of the time, it is slightly heavier and slightly longer than a Mark 14. So there's a good chance that the Mark 8 won't fit into the torpedo tubes designed to hold a Mark 14, much in the same way as the Mark 10 capable torpedo tubes on the American S-class couldn't fit the Mark 14 because it was bigger than the Mark 10 torpedo. And the other problem is that if you see my video on USS Cod, where we actually look into one of the torpedo tubes, you've got these very specific points where the various data set sections come down to, just course, speed, heading, depth, and all of this kind of stuff. Obviously, that's specifically matched to where those ingress points are on the Mark 14. If you stick a Mark 8 in there, even if the Mark 8 would fit, the specific points where all those factors are going to be altered to program the torpedo aren't going to be in the same place as a Mark 14. What you might be able to do, and I stress might, would be to detach the warhead, because detaching the warhead off a torpedo was already a thing, and maybe come up with some kind of jury rig where you could take the warhead of a Mark 8, make appropriate minor weight adjustments, and put it onto the body of a Mark 14. In theory, then, it should fit in the tubes. You would be able to program it properly. And, of course, since most of the problem with the Mark 14 was the Mark 6 exploder, which is in with the warhead, by replacing it with a Mark 8 warhead with its British contact exploder, you would in theory solve most of the problems, but you would obviously have to check the weight and balance. Jeff asks, on your last video, a comment you made reminded me of a question. The breech-loading 14-inch guns on the King George V class are often quoted by wearaboos as unable to penetrate Bismarck. I'm aware it can penetrate the unarmoured sections, and Prince of Wales did score meaningful hits, but based on armour penetration tables, could a King George V punch through Bismarck's main belt? Ah yes, the Bismarck Uber Alles version of wearaboos. Yeah, they're hopelessly off their rocker as usual. Yes, of course a King George V's guns can punch through Bismarck's main belt. And if they want evidence, well, they can go and download the dive report from Bismarck's wreck, which is hosted on my website and I think linked in the video description of the video I did on the Cameron report and what it actually says versus what the wearaboos claim that it says. Because, well, the Bismarck's conning tower is actually thicker than its belt, and there's at least one 14-inch hole in the conning tower, and, as per the report, there's also one or two, just for them at least, distressingly 14-inch shaped holes in Bismarck's armour belt as well, which is kind of, yeah, physically there is evidence because there is a hole in the belt. I mean, Rodney's guns also did a lot of damage, and there are holes from 16-inch guns as well, but there you go. And if you go by various armour penetration tables, then in theory, King George V's guns can punch through Bismarck's belt at anything under about 19,000 yards or so. Now, of course, that does come with the caveat that those figures are generally calculated assuming the two ships are fully broadside onto each other, so if there's an additional angle other than the vertical fall in play, i.e., maybe Bismarck's a couple of miles ahead or behind the King George V, that's going to increase the apparent angling of the armour, and so you might need to get a bit closer, but obviously vice versa applies. But yeah, within the reasonable battle ranges of World War II battleships, and certainly within the expected battle range of a King George V, its 14-inch guns are quite capable of punching through Bismarck's armour belt. Now, what happens once they get through that and they encounter the turtleback deck is a slightly different kettle of fish to discuss, and that gets very, very much more complex because you've now got to deal with post-penetration shells. How intact are they? What angle are they now going at? What velocity are they going at? How is that interacting with the angled deck? And so on and so forth. Again, some people were like, oh no, well, the turtle deck will just reject all the shells. I've got news for you. Look up the full range of Bismarck survivor stories. I can absolutely assure you that armoured deck did not reject all of the shells that punched through Bismarck's sides, because otherwise you're going to be very, very hard pressed to explain the waterfalls that were coming through into some of the machinery bases, as accounted for by some of the Bismarck survivors. And the video on that fleet air armour crash that nearly took out my grandfather triggered a few different questions about my various ancestors, so I'm going to group 3 of them into this one question and answer them as kind of quickfire style. BK Zhong asks, you mentioned you lost a great uncle on Royal Oak. That is indeed the case. Are there any other close calls involving your family in either World War? Yeah, there are a few. They got up to some pretty intense shenanigans, although broadly following the general family principle going back multiple centuries of do the more reckless and insane and dangerous things and your chances of survival go exponentially up. Do the safe thing and you will almost certainly die horribly. But very briefly, I think probably the exemplar of this would actually be the reason why my grandfather, who was the youngest of his generation, actually grew up without a father, because his father, my great-grandfather, was in the First World War. He was actually part of 5th Army Supply Corps, so went over with the original BEF, and, well, there's a whole load of shenanigans he got up to which were quite dangerous, which was probably suitable for another video at some point, but his last days on the front line in World War I were spent in the period when gas attacks were just becoming a thing. and he was driving a supply truck to the rear echelons of the front lines, because obviously you're not going to drive a truck all the way to the front line trenches, and the trench system's quite deep. But he was there when one of the first gas attacks happened. The rest of his unit, rather understandably, went, yeah, we're not equipped for this. We're going to drive away now. He, however, decided that he could see, walking wounded coming back, and he decided, actually, you know what, and chucked all of the supplies that he had on the truck off the truck, and then spent some time hanging around on the periphery of the poison gas cloud, helping the wounded onto his truck, and then driving them back for treatment, obviously without which some of them might not have made it. The downside being that obviously he was on the peripheral edge of probably a chlorine gas cloud, which didn't do his own lungs much good. So he got mentioned in dispatches, but also then invalided home because, well, yeah, you can imagine the number that did on him. Unfortunately, one of the casualties of that particular escapade was also his sense of smell, which meant that fast forward to the middle of the interwar period, when my great-grandmother was pregnant with my grandfather, and my great-grandfather went down to the barn at the end of the family property to work on a car, and he had the car up and running to try and discern what the annoying problems and noises coming from it were. The wind blew the barn door shut, and, well, with no sense of smell, he didn't smell the rising amount of toxic fumes that were building up in there, and, well, that was pretty much that. Admiral 5113 asked, if you can you tell us a bit more about the pyromania you mentioned? Yeah, so along with a deep and burning desire to do insanely reckless things, that's my sort of paternal line also seems to have a deep and burning desire to see things deeply burning. If you go back far enough, one of my ancestors who ended up facing my wife's direct ancestors on the opposite sides of one of the Jacobite uprising battles, as some of you who are historians of that period might know, colonels of the regiment, of which he was one, usually would pay out of their own pocket for extras. That could be they wanted their men to look really snazzy, so they'd have coloured epaulets or coloured lapels, or better rations, or new uniforms, or all sorts of things that would make them look good. This particular ancestor of mine decided, no. The thing that an infantry regiment or regiment of foot really needs is field guns, which was a huge surprise to the Highlanders when they thought they were charging down a bunch of people with slow-loading muskets, and then they took 2 steps back. It's like, where the heck did that battery of 6-pounders come from, loaded with, canister, great. And another ancestor, although technically not my direct ancestor, but the brother of one of my direct ancestors, decided, apropos of almost nothing, that he was going to try and blow an island off the face of the landscape on Lake Windermere. Yeah, unsurprisingly, they did eventually end up committing that guy to an asylum because he scared the living daylights out of everybody in the Lake District when he made a reasonable attempt at doing so with a particularly worryingly large amount of gunpowder. And Robert Stewart asks, you said that the aircraft crashed in a beet field. Were your family beet farmers? So, at least at that stage, my great-grandfather's time period, most of the farming around Market Deeping and Deeping St. James was more wheat, barley, oats, that kind of stuff. Some potatoes as well. Fair amount of potatoes, actually, considering the landscape and the watering available there. But sugar beet farming was a growing industry. There were various sugar beet factories built in the 1920s around there, and certainly by the 30s when the plane came crashing down, it's not exactly surprising there would be a number of sugar beet fields in the area. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, if by some interesting antics the First and Second World War King George V swapped places on January 1st, 1916 and January 1st, 1941, what impact would the swap cause in both cases, assuming all specifications of the original World War I King George V need to be maintained in the latter case? Well, this is actually quite an interesting question. Not necessarily because of strictly the combat effects of it, but on the impacts on the timeline upstream and downstream. So if we take the World War II King George V and port it back to January 1st, 1916, obviously a lot of this will depend on, does the crew and the knowledge to operate the ship come with it, or is it just the ship itself? So if we're assuming, for the sake of having an interesting discussion, that the crew come back, or at least sufficient instructions to tell people in 1916 how to operate the thing, the single biggest advantage that you're going to get from the 1940s King George V is the radar, because, well, all of those issues working out where the German fleet were going because they disappeared into the haze at Jutland, yeah, in this case that ain't going to happen. You just have King George V, this version, somewhere in either the middle or towards the front of the fleet, and she can just go, yep, they're going that way. Everybody go that way. Now, of course, being a fast battleship, she's actually faster than most of the battlecruisers around, so you can probably bet your life Beatty will be thrashing at the leash trying to get his hands on it. But given that she's an individual ship and the absolute advantage that the radar is going to give her, plus, of course, the fact she's very heavily armoured, I have a feeling Jellicoe's going to put his foot down and go, nope, she's staying with the Grand Fleet because that's giving us a colossal advantage for naval gunnery and spotting in a battle line action. So that's her single biggest combat impact. Now, the reason why I said this is an interesting question is because a huge amount of what's aboard her can then be replicated in some way, shape, or form, and that's going to hugely affect the timeline that this has created, because thanks to the Washington Treaty capping both gun caliber and displacement, although King George V of the 1940s is a massive advancement on the ships of the mid-1910s, she's not that much of an advancement that they won't know how to then take and replicate an awful lot of what she has aboard. Now, okay, replicating the radar might take a bit of a time because there is certain technology that would have to be developed, and obviously historically was developed in the intervening period to get the radar working. But things like the very large optical rangefinders you find in the ship's turrets, the slightly different mix of steel that's used in her armour, the engine technology, slightly higher pressure than some boilers found in the fleet, but also just more compact, more efficient, more energy dense boilers. Again, once they've taken one apart to have a look, there's not a huge amount strictly stopping them from replicating something like that or close to it very quickly. The same with hull design and even the fire control system, the Admiralty Fire Control Table Mark 10. Obviously significantly in advance of the Dreher tables they're using, and yes, probably will take a little bit of time to work out, but not something that by, let's say, 1920, they couldn't have figured out, again, either how to replicate or how to replicate a close version thereof. So giving the Royal Navy a very significant technological leap going forwards. So the Nelson class, for example, maybe even Hood, given that Hood was somewhat redesigned after Jutland and this ship would be around that time, those later Royal Navy ships would have considerably more advanced tech on board than you would see historically. And of course, a good chunk of that can also be retrofitted into older ships. Now, assuming that this swap doesn't immediately change the timeline in which the World War I King George V is appearing in 1941, so assuming we've got branching timelines, the appearance of the World War I King George V throws the Royal Navy into a real quandary, because obviously King George V was the first modern fast capital ship that came online for the Royal Navy. Now they've got a functional, but still old and significantly out of date 13.5-inch armed ship, which, okay, it's better than nothing. She'll make a decent convoy escort, alongside an R, the R class and Barham and Malaya where necessary. But in January 1941, there's not really the time or the resources to do much than the barest modernization, probably focusing on giving her some actual functional anti-aircraft armament. And now they've got to scramble because if-when the Germans deploy their own fast capital ships, well, when Bismarck and Prince Eugen sailed, you had King George V, Prince of Wales, and Hood as the only real true fast capital ships available, and Prince of Wales only marginally. In this situation, ironically enough, Denmark Strait is still going to be Prince of Wales and Hood, but Victorious will probably have to come along, because part of the reason for King George V and Victorious staying back was to form some kind of reserve to coordinate things. If you don't have the modern King George V, well, that's basically your lot. There's no point leaving Victorious behind. And of course, if Denmark Strait goes as badly as it did historically, although with Victorious there that might not happen, it then means that it's going to be Rodney versus Bismarck in a 1v1 rather than Rodney and King George V versus Bismarck. Andrew Kirshenman asks, can you give a brief history of the role of chaplains in various navies? Did they have other jobs on smaller ships, and how did the rest of the crew feel about them? Unfortunately, this isn't an element of naval history I know a vast amount about, and most of what I know is confined to the Royal Navy, basically, because I keep running into references to them. So, from what I know, the idea of a chaplain or a man of the cloth of some description being present on Royal Navy ships goes back technically further than what you would traditionally say is the Royal Navy. Most people tend to take the Royal Navy officially as having started with Henry VIII, although obviously some do make an argument for King Alfred, but if we go with Henry VIII, then it goes back about 500 years even before that, where ships were supposed to carry priests, so hence why I say chaplain or something equivalent thereunto. And partly this was because ships were obviously taking on longer and longer voyages, and therefore there was a chance that a good Christian sailor might miss their Sunday services if there wasn't somebody on board who could administer that while they were at sea. But also you've got to remember that sailors are historically a very superstitious lot, and as we've discussed in previous dry docks, there were all sorts of complex, dedicated gods and cults and temples and votive offerings and stuff in pre-Christian times that sailors would very heavily patronize to keep them safe at sea. And so it's not really surprising that with the resurgence of long-distance shipping in Western Europe, they were like, yeah, we now, instead of sacrificing a bull to Poseidon or something, we should take a priest along to pray for our souls and make sure that if we die in a state of grace. I think that's how it's supposed to be worded, at least. I don't know. But one of the interesting things is that you can usually tell when laws and rules aren't being followed because they keep being reissued, and consistently throughout English history, every 50 to 100 years or so, there'll be a new proclamation that says, yeah, by the way, guys, you are supposed to have a priest or a chaplain on board all of the ships, or at least on board all of the king's ships. And the fact they keep having to state it means that probably, initially there was some compliance, and then it gradually dropped away until people were getting worried, and then a new law was issued, and the cycle repeated. And of course, at some periods, like say in the period of the English Republic or the English Commonwealth, there would be an awful lot of priests, vicars, I don't know, whatever the Puritans had as their equivalent. Anyway, the chaplain equivalent would be present on pretty much every ship in the Commonwealth because, Puritanism. But then it seems to die away again. So by the Napoleonic period, even in large ships, in something, say, the size of Nelson's fleet, 25 to 30 ships, there might only be half a dozen chaplains. And on smaller ships, there just flat out wouldn't be because there wasn't the space and there wasn't the resources. And to be honest, at that point, there weren't the number of chaplains willing to go to sea either. Now, contrast this with some other navies. For example, during the time of the Spanish Armada, in part because the Spanish Armada was viewed as something of a crusade, but also because, Spain was, and to a certain extent still is, as far as I understand it, a very Catholic country. There were a lot more religious people, as in friars, chaplains, priests, whatever, on board the Armada than there were in the equivalent English fleet. But, outside of that particular snapshot, I don't know how prevalent it was to have a chaplain at what size of ship in the Spanish fleet outside of that particular campaign. The interesting thing is that as ships grew in size and crew numbers, and of course grew in terms of regularities, steaming efficiency and so forth, they could guarantee they were going to be in one place at a time. The number of chaplains and the rigidity of the program that was enforced in the Royal Navy actually began to grow and settle. So by the end of the 19th century, there was a mandatory sermon on Sunday, mandatory prayers, and when I say mandatory, everybody had to attend. So when you go through World War II, for example, especially when I was looking up the various survivors and veterans accounts from HMS Belfast writing my book, you come across all sorts of shenanigans going on where people who don't particularly want to attend the various religious services contrive all sorts of interesting methods to try and escape them, whether that be through getting themselves assigned to a specific duty that cannot be left alone while the service is going on, or just hiding in remote parts of the ship and hoping that nobody notices. And of course, how the crew felt towards the chaplain would very much depend, I suppose, on the degree of religious faith that the average crewman had, which is going to wax and wane over time quite considerably. Tanko Dromis asks, what is the development history of the Nelson class's 6-inch turrets? Were these turrets developed based on the turret installed on HMS Enterprise? So the answer is no, the Nelson turrets aren't descended from the Enterprise turret, but they are somewhat similar because Vickers was given the task of designing both gun mountings, which is why the turrets look very similar from an external perspective. But the Nelson class, among other things, they have a higher elevation because there was originally a thought of using them against aircraft than the turret on Enterprise. There's a few other differences as well, specific models of gun being used and so on and so forth. But essentially what happened was that at roughly the same time, Vickers was asked, can you make a prototype twin mounting for a potential future use in cruisers, which is what became Enterprise's turret. And then separately, they were actually asked initially, can you make a twin 6-inch mounting, a little bit of a heavier one, that is designed for use on the G3 class Battlecruisers? And then that became the one that would then be used on the Nelsons with a little bit of revision. So essentially the Nelson class have ex-G3 twin 6-inch turrets, so a capital ship design rather than the cruiser type design which was installed on Enterprise, much in the same way as the relatively boxy mountings for twin 5-inch 38s on US ships from a visual perspective can look very, very similar, but when you actually look at the exact statistics of them, exactly how thick the turret walls are and so on and so forth can actually vary quite considerably between, let's say, the twin 5-inch 38 found on a Gearing and the twin 5-inch 38 found on an Iowa, and similarly with the Enterprise and Nelson turrets. Nathan Redder asks, what procedure do museum ships follow when they find personal items like letters or pictures? Do they allow any living relatives the chance to claim these items? In my opinion, it would seem wrong for a museum to keep such personal effects without at least attempting to contact living family. Now, I don't know if the procedure varies from museum ship to museum ship. It probably does to a small degree, partly based on the age of the ship and also who is actually owning and operating the ship. If it's a ship that still belongs to the Navy, whatever Navy that happens to be, versus a ship that may be in state government hands, as in national level government hands, or indeed state government hands in terms of US state hands, or a completely private foundation, or some combination thereof. If you, let's face it, if you somehow found a letter from, 1806 hidden in some part of HMS Victory that somehow hasn't been explored in the intervening 200 plus years, it's probably safe to say that that is a historical artifact and can probably be processed into the museum's collection with any attempts to trace the descendants of who it was sent to being, they'd probably do it, but it's going to be a secondary concern. Whereas if it's a ship that was decommissioned within living memory and, either the person that letter was written to or their immediate descendants, sons, daughters, etc., might very well still be around, then as far as I'm aware, at that point, museum ships definitely do, take the first step of trying to work out, okay, who was this sent to? Are they still around? Do they have any immediate relatives who might otherwise be interested? If not, and then try and make a good faith effort to contact them to, say, look, this letter, do you want it, kind of thing. But obviously also then scanning it for posterity in their collection. Packer 910 asks, if the Japanese had attacked Russia across Manchuria instead of turning toward Pearl Harbor, what role would the Imperial Japanese Navy have played, i.e. how would they have been used? I suspect the first use for maybe, the first 5 minutes of such a conflict would have been to have an even more lopsided Imperial Japanese combined fleet versus Russian Pacific Fleet or Pacific Squadron rematch. And, once the Russian Pacific forces are completely and thoroughly dealt with, you pretty much probably look to the way that the Japanese handled their China campaign as how they would handle a Manchuria campaign into Russia as well. So you'd have carriers providing mobile air support, obviously landings and supplies coordinated with the Japanese Navy for escort and so forth. But there wouldn't be a huge amount else for them to do. They might end up doing a decent amount of shore bombardment out of sheer boredom, if nothing else, along with, obviously, as I said, the carrier strikes. But the land-based elements of the Japanese Navy, particularly their bomber forces, would probably see quite a bit of involvement. Again, partly just because, well, they'd be very bored otherwise, and they need to take some of the glory. Otherwise, you can't let the Imperial Japanese Army get all the glory for a campaign. And finally for this week, Smokey the Bear asks, in the recent guides on US Navy destroyer escorts, there's a variety of drivetrains used with various effects on speed and range. Is there something that could be referred to that compares the energy densities, fuel capacities, and efficiencies of each stage of each drivetrain from fuel to propellers that would help to understand this better? I don't know if there's any publicly available detailed breakdown and comparison on the level of, well, we put so much oil into the boilers of this ship that's driven by turbines, and we get so much percentage out of the boilers, which then goes into the turbines, and we get so much percentage out of the turbines, and then to the props, versus we put a similar amount of diesel into the diesel engines, and we get this much efficiency out of them, and versus the diesel electric ships, and so on and so forth. I don't know that anybody's done that level of equation. Of course, there is the more obvious, general equation of here's a turbo electric ship, here's a diesel electric ship, here's a pure diesel drive ship, a turbine ship or whatever, and here's how much fuel they carry, here's the range they got out of that amount of fuel, and here's the overall displacement of the ship. And I think the displacements of the machinery are probably also available. So you could work out things like, miles per ton of machinery, miles per ton of fuel. That would give you basic efficiencies for the entire drivetrain. But I don't know that anyone's broken it down by subcomponent of the drivetrain, although theoretically those figures should be available because the specific initially fuel and then energy consumption figures for each of those bits of machinery would need to be known in order for them to calculate the overall range figures in the first place. But those figures, while they exist, would be kind of manufacturer's specs and maybe buried somewhere in a US archive. Might be an interesting project for someone to do, but at kind of an intermediate level, it would be quite interesting to compare the plans of the various ships and go, okay, well, in each ship, you get this much tonnage and this much square footage taken up by the machinery, and that equates to this much range and this much, and this many miles per ton or for fuel and all of that kind of stuff. That would actually be quite interesting to work out on a little bit of a more granular level. Although working out what I think you're asking would be another step beyond that, which again would be very interesting, but a lot of work. And that brings us to an end for this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this Drydock, and I hope you'll enjoy others in the future, as well as, of course, the other videos I do. So see you in one of those at some point soon. Bye for now.